All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the March meeting of the Lincoln County Democratic Committee. I'm going to call the meeting to order. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith Mestrich. I'm the chair of the Lincoln County Democratic Committee. Welcome, everybody, both here in the room. It looks like we have about 20 people here in the room, and I'm not by my computer. How many do we have online, Carol? About 40 online, so a nice turnout after just having a meeting last week with Shelly Pingree, and for all of those of you who go participate in that was terrific. We got a nice audience of 100 with her. They had 13,000 on her teletown hall the other night, so it was a little bit more intimate experience for us. We have a great agenda tonight. My friend Garrett Martin from the Maine Center for Economic Policy is here with us, is going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening in Augusta from a budget perspective and a number of other things, but also talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington and the impact in Maine, and have plenty of time for Q&A. Okay. So there is, to say the least, there's a lot going on in this country and in this state, and it is really hard to keep track of everything that happens. But we are really lucky in this state to have an organization like the Maine Center for Economic Policy. They are tracking everything that has to do with our budget, with everything that impacts the fiscal, situation in the state, all the taxation issues. They advocate for a lot of really, really good policies. They keep an eye on what's happening on Washington. They track everything down to the county and sometimes even the municipal level. And they do it. And we are really, really fortunate to be joined by their president tonight, Garrett Martin, who just leads that organization and is taking some time from a really, really busy schedule to be here and talk with us a little bit tonight and give a presentation about what's going on and really answer a lot of your questions. So with no further ado, Garrett, welcome.
I think I understand that the drill is to stand here. Is that on that X? X marks the spot. I will do my best. And Autumn, you can do the first slide, and I'll give you the cue on the advance. So first of all, just thank you for inviting me to be here tonight, Keith. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Maine Center for Economic Policy, as Keith alluded to, we do research and analysis on economic policy issues in the state of Maine. And ultimately, our primary goal is to make sure that all Mainers have a fair chance at a good life. And the reality is, I think a lot of people have undermined and discounted the role that public policy and the government play in creating a balance in which we have better economic outcomes and in which people can pursue a good life. And I think that my own personal experience that way is reflective, which is I'm a generation removed from poverty. My dad grew up in rural North Carolina, and when he was a senior in high school, his father committed suicide. And he basically became responsible for helping to raise his siblings, and grew up in part down the road from an orphanage, which is where he got a lot of his clothes and food. But he was lucky enough to have a high school chemistry teacher who kicked his butt and challenged him and kept raising the bar for him. And she ultimately was the person who helped him apply to college and get a scholarship, more importantly, to college, because as he said to me the other day when I was talking about this with him, he said, there was no way I was going to college if I had any debt. Because the summer before his freshman year in college, he had to work 70 hours a week at 70 cents an hour in a minimum wage job so that he could provide for his family first and then have a little bit left over to help fund what remained in his balance for college. But the point of that is that had he not been in a community in which they had made investments in their local schools and Miss Cheryl had been hired as the chemistry teacher, I think his life's trajectory would look a lot different. So he went on to go to med school. He graduated from Wake Forest University. He was in the Air Force for a couple of years, right at the end of the Vietnam War. And as my wife often notes, he's one of the rare, my parents are some of the rare people who have transcended class, in the sense that I stand before you having benefited from his success, which again has a lot to do with the commitments and supports that his family was able to benefit from along the way that were the result of public investments. So when we talk about the reality of this past election, and in that context, I think one thing that's really important to acknowledge is that people were struggling to get by long before inflation hit post-COVID. So Autumn, if we can go to the next slide. So rising costs had been squeezing families for years. And what this slide represents is rising cost from 2000 to 2024. So when we talk about food, which certainly got the bulk of attention in the last election cycle, for that 24-year period, they've been up about 27% in real terms. So a family in a household, and this is Maine-based data, by the way. So a household in 2000 was spending roughly $6,700 on food in nominal terms, and in 2024 they were spending about $17,000. So if you adjust for inflation, that's a 27% increase. Healthcare expenditures for households have gone up about 69% in that 24-year period. And that means in 2000, you're talking about roughly $3,500 for a family, or for an individual. This is actually per capita. It's a consumer expenditure survey, and roughly $10,000 currently. Now, what this healthcare figure doesn't reflect is additional spending that's made in support of families having access to healthcare through programs like Medicaid and Medicare, which are huge programs as well that provide access to health coverage. If you book those in, the number would be even higher. Housing costs. We hear a lot about housing, and part of the reason why we hear a lot about housing is that in the last 3 years, housing prices, the median home price in Maine has skyrocketed. So we are now at a point in Maine where 80% of people earning the median income can't afford to buy a house in Maine based on median home prices. That is the highest that has been in 30 years. So the housing cost inflation, a lot's happened in the last couple of years, but it was going up already, right? So over that 20-year period, 24-year period, it's gone up 85%. But here's the one that jumps out for me, is higher education costs. Higher education costs have gone through the roof. In 2000, the cost to go tuition and fees to the University of Maine was tuition and fees, $4,500. Last year, tuition fees, $13,700. Now that's before you get into room and board and all those other expenses, which basically gets you up to about $35,000 when it's all said and done. But the point is, and you see this in the data for the state of Maine, and you see this across the country, which is as states reduce their investments in higher education, what do you think happened to the costs that families incurred? They went up dramatically. And so that's a big part of this story, is the divestment in public structures like higher ed and colleges have meant that families have to pay more. It probably would have meant in the case of my dad that he might not have ever gone to college, right? So these investments matter, and they make a difference in people's lives. So this is the expenditure side of the ledger. Autumn, if we can go to the next slide, please. This is kind of fun. It's like, Autumn, are you there? And go ahead and flip through the next one, please. So incomes aren't keeping pace. At the same time that these costs are rising in real terms, median household income is only going up 5% from 2000 to 2024. And so what we see is in $2,000, the median household income in Maine was roughly $38,000. Today, it's a little under $71,000. So that's a pretty significant bump in terms of the dollar amount, but when you account for the rising prices of goods, it's roughly a 5% pace. Now, what's interesting about this figure is, and with all these figures, quite frankly, is people's experience in the economy also varies based on a lot of other factors, right? So when we look at this 5% increase, that's the median. But for households that are on the low end of the income ladder, they have actually lost ground. They've actually seen a decline in their household income relative to the rising cost of goods. Upper income households are actually seeing an even greater increase, right? So we're seeing that sort of inequality play out even today in terms of that, that dispersion between incomes. But that's data from the last 24 years. Now, we didn't get here by accident, and this is the point that I really want to drive home. So next slide, please, Autumn. So this is my, when I started working on these issues, this is like the slide that, the data point that is, I just carry with me all the time. So what it portrays is growth in productivity over time and growth in hourly wages. And what you see is post-World War II in this country, we were increasingly productive, but what was happening with wages? Well, the gains to productivity were basically translating to wage growth for families. And that is tied to the boom of the middle class, right? Everybody has heard this phenomenon. That was a result of two very important factors. One was public investments in our infrastructure in this country, in manufacturing capacity, and a whole host of other things that help boost economic activity. And then increases in education. So the GI Bill helped promote widespread education, skilled attainment, and again, with those productivity gains, the benefits of that accrued to workers. But then you see in the early 70s, it starts to unravel. And from 1979 to roughly now, there's been an 81% increase in productivity and a 29% increase in hourly wages. So that unraveling has to do with a variety of things. But there are three things I want you to sit with. One is tax policy. So what happened in the early 80s? A guy named Ronald Reagan became president. And if you read what Ronald Reagan's platform was when he became president, it is eerily familiar. He wanted to eliminate the Department of Education. He wanted to cut taxes for rich people. So our top tax rate in this country, when he was president, went from 70% top marginal rate to 28%. He just gave a huge windfall. And what that did, related to this, is it changed the dynamics of how CEOs were getting paid and what the incentives were for what we call in economics extracting rents from workers to pay those at the top. Deregulation, that's another thing. If we're not protecting workers, if we're not structuring the rules of the game in such a way that workers can get ahead, then they're going to go behind. And then unionization. But on the deregulation front, I just want to share a quick anecdote. So when I was a kid, I used to play Monopoly. I have two older brothers, right? I could never beat my brothers. Never beat them. And then I would go and I would play with my friends. And I would try to do something that my brothers had taught me to do. And they'd be like, no, you can't play that way. What are you doing? I say, what do you mean? They said, no, that's not the rules. I was like, really? They're like, yeah. So it turned out that I was always playing a rigged game with my brothers, right? Well, starting in 1979, it turned out my brothers got a hold of the economy. And they've been rigging the rules ever since. So I think what's important there is to recognize that we are the ones who define the rules of our economy. It's not like this phenomenon over which we have no control. We structure those rules. So when we think about what this looks like in terms maybe that might have a little more resonance, let's go to the next slide, please, Autumn. We worked hard on this. So in 1975, you've got your Lego worker, but actually look at them down here low, okay? So in 1975, the average worker was earning, the average CEO was earning 25 times more than the average worker, okay? Anybody want to guess what it is today? Don't we wish it were the same? I heard 75, 95. Can I hear 200, 200, 200 here, 200, one's good, 4,000. Okay, let's hit it, Autumn. 300 times. So our little Lego guy, you can't even really see him. He's a speck down here saying, don't step on me, Paul. But that gives you a sense of proportionality. So we went from a period of time in which 25 to 1, now 300 to 1. So no surprise at inequality. So when we go back to the rules of the game and we go back to that Monopoly game, here's the question we have to ask ourselves. You know, has everybody here played Monopoly before? So you know when you get to the point in the game where like somebody owns all the properties and you just know you're getting dinged every time you roll the freaking dice? And like, yes, I can land on community chess once or twice and that might extend the game another turn or two, but basically the game is over, right? Is that where we are? Or are we going to show up and restructure the rules of the game so that we're not playing Monopoly. We're doing something very different. We're building communities and we're creating opportunity, right? So that's our challenge in this moment. So next, you can skip the next slide, I think, if it's the one I think it is. Or, oh no, stay right there. Okay. So here's the deal. Again, we can build an economy that works for us, that works to give all Maine people a better chance at a good life. And we have some clear examples of how we have done that in this state, where public policy has made a difference. So one example is our universal free school meal program. We've got 172,000 kids who are now eligible for universal free school meals. And the friends I have, and Enoch can regale us with stories about this, but when kids show up hungry to school, you think they're ready to learn? No. So this has really been an important program for the development of children in our state. In addition, though, what's interesting is some of the stuff we're doing in schools with regard to food is also tying it to local farms, right? So you heard Representative Pingree speak last week. This is something she's worked very hard on. And that has had an economic benefit with farmers and in communities as well, right? So that's an important thing. 100,000 more people have health insurance in Maine today than they did in 2016. Why? Because Maine voters went to the polls and voted to expand Medicaid, provide access to health care for our neighbors who couldn't afford it. Now, I'm proud to say that I was one of the lead organizations and was actually on the steering committee for that campaign. That is a project that MESEP worked a lot on. And we developed all the analysis to say, by leaving this money on the table, we were losing $500 million a year and 95,000 people weren't getting access to health coverage. And as a consequence, there were people who were dying. So in housing, the legislature passed a budget that had $100 million in new investment in housing, some emergency housing, some building and construction. That's going to take some time to come online, but that was 2023. And then we have this thing called free community college. So we have 17,000 students now, recent high school graduates, who are getting a free education through the community college system in this state. And I can tell you from working up at Lincoln Academy, that's made a difference for some kids in terms of both how they're thinking about whether or not they're going to go to college and what kind of path they then go on to after college in terms of job opportunities and those kinds of things. So, you know, that's clearly a way in which we're making a difference in terms of helping people deal with cost and promoting opportunity. But let's talk about another way we're making a difference. Go ahead, Autumn. So not only can policy help ensure that people have access to food, shelter, housing, those kinds of things, it can also enhance or diminish their income, right? So another thing we did in 2016, and I actually wrote this one, we passed a bill through referendum to become law to raise the minimum wage for Maine workers. That is still in effect. And the most important thing we did with that was index it to inflation, which meant that the minimum wage was going to go up every year with the cost of goods and services. And so that has translated into 1 in 4 workers getting a raise. This year, there are more than 37,000 workers in the state who are going to get an additional $1,000 in income because of the increase in minimum wage from 2024 to 2025. There's another 59,000 workers who weren't working at the minimum wage before but are just above it who would get a bump as well. So this is hugely consequential. The other thing we've done is we've actually done a lot of work under the hood of our tax system. And this is where MESEP sort of does a lot of its work. But even during the LePage years, we managed to book some tax credits that mean that at the end of the day, families in the bottom 20% of households in this state are getting, on average, another $960 just by filing their taxes. So if you know people in this community who are struggling to make ends meet, please make sure they're filing their taxes, because it turns out that at the time when LePage was slashing and burning some of our safety net programs, we were booking some money through the tax code that means that even if you don't make enough to owe taxes, you get money back through the sales tax fairness credit, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and the property tax fairness credit. So those are all vitally important programs to low and moderate income people. Okay, so, but here's the rub. Next slide, please. Great, we can do all this stuff at the state level, but the reality is federal funds are where it's at. Okay, so we get $20 billion in the state of Maine coming from federal sources. And that $20 billion goes to in a variety of different directions. So some of it comes to the state to reimburse for programs like Maine Care and some of those federal state partnerships. Some of that money goes directly to individuals. Social Security, anybody? Right? Some of that money goes to for-profit businesses. Now, it turns out that of that $2.9 billion, 2.8 of it goes to BIW. Some of it goes to nonprofit organizations that are delivering services. Some of it comes to local governments. Glidden Street repairs, anybody in the last year? That was federal money. That was all federal money, right? So I think that's one thing that's really important to acknowledge, is that a lot of the things we've been able to do in the state do rely on federal funds. And one thing I want to point out is that Governor LePage, when he was in office, refused almost $2.3 billion in federal funds, and it created a drag on our economy. Maine had one of the slowest recoveries from the Great Recession of any other states in the country. You flip that, and we talked to Governor Mills when she was running for office the first time. She had this report. She's like, I want to understand more and where the money is, basically. But you flip that, and under Governor Mills, Maine has actually had one of the fastest recoveries out of COVID of any state. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which we both leverage and put to work federal funds in our state. Okay, so there are 12,000 federal workers in Maine. And the other thing is that these federal funds cover 2/3 of the cost of health coverage for 400,000 Mainers. So half of our kids in this state rely on health coverage that is largely funded through federal sources. Half. So when you hear Washington talking about cutting Medicaid, they're talking about cutting health care for as many as 400,000 people in this state. Now, here's one of the challenges, and your all's challenge and my challenge is always to help people connect the dots. So one thing that I think is endlessly amusing to me about Maine Care is that it's called Maine Care. So people who have that form of health coverage don't connect it to Medicaid. They don't think you're talking about their health insurance when you're talking about Maine Care, but you actually are. And it's going to be too little too late when they go, oh, wait, I just lost my health coverage. How did that happen? It wasn't some bureaucrat at the state government making it harder for you to enroll. That was a policy that got passed at the federal level and shoved down our throats, all to fund tax cuts for billionaires. Okay, so next slide, please, Autumn. So here we go. I think you got the picture, right? There's a lot of great things we do at the state level, but there's a lot of resources that bolster those efforts coming from the federal level. And what's happening right now is that the chaos, the corruption, and the cuts that we're talking about are really starting to ripple through. So the chaos, right? Tariffs on again, off again. What's happening there? I mean, I was down in D.C. a couple of weeks ago, meeting with Senator King, and somebody came in after me who was from the tourism, hospitality industry in southern Maine. He said the day after Trump announced the tariffs and had the commentary toward Canada, he had 6 cancellations from Canadian customers who've been longtime customers. So that's just one little example. My daughter is at the Darling Marine Center. She's in the graduate program there. And after Trump issued his one of his early executive orders, her advisor pulled her aside. This is like within her first week starting her master's program, and said, well, I'm not sure we're going to have funding for you for your second year now. Right? So these things are going to ripple through. I was up in Bangor a couple of weeks ago with a roundtable of people who've been affected by the layoffs, one of whom was an Air Force veteran who was working at Togus. And his story was he was putting his kids to bed, and he got a text from a supervisor saying, you better check your email. Don't come in tomorrow. Right? Well, the good news is he's been taken off his leave, but he still doesn't know if he actually is going to have a job in another week or two. So that kind of stuff is just taking us in the wrong direction. So everywhere where we've made progress is under threat. And the other reason why it's under threat is if this federal partnership that we have goes away, it's not unlike our friends in Europe seeing historic partnerships go away. There's a cost then that comes to us. And it's a human cost in terms of the people who are going to lose certain things, but it's also going to be a financial cost to the state. Because in order to continue to provide health coverage or do those things, we're going to have to pick up the tab. So for us to make up the resources that we could potentially lose from the federal government, we would have to increase our taxes by 5-fold. And I don't think that's going to happen, right? So every dollar we pay in federal taxes, we get $1.67 back from the feds. All right, next slide. So, all right, here we go. About to wrap up, Keith. What do we need to continue to do to lead? And this gets into what's going on in Augusta right now. First of all, we need to stand up for all workers. What do I mean by that? Well, luckily, the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, passed a budget, and they did so without Republican support. Why did they do that? Because they didn't want people's health coverage, state employees' jobs, to be held hostage. And that's what was going to happen. And it became very clear in the process of trying to pass what's called a supplemental budget, so an adjustment to the previous budget, to fund some health coverage and also to make sure that the spruce budworm resources were available to keep that infestation down in northern Maine. Republicans walked away from a deal where they had unanimously supported it from the Appropriations Committee. So they just kept moving the ball. But here's the rub. Even the governor put out in her budget proposal a proposal that freezes cost of living adjustments for certain workers, direct care workers, and did so while leaving other people who have the resources to contribute harmless, right? So the budget is currently being balanced on the backs, potentially, of direct care workers. There were also cuts to child care, which luckily the legislature managed to sort of deal with. And the day that we had 350 child care providers show up at the State House was quite a day. So we need to keep talking to your reps about standing up for all workers. Another place where this administration has fallen short for workers is farm workers. Farm workers are not covered by minimum wage laws. That was a deal that was cut with Southern Dixiecrats back in the 40s around the Fair Labor Standards Act that carved out certain classes of workers who historically were women or black. And that legacy continues to this day. We had a bill to raise minimum wage for farm workers, which the governor vetoed. So there's still work there to be done. Protecting vital investments in Maine people and communities, particularly in the areas of healthcare, childcare, higher education. So this budget that passed, it does not include funding for free community college beyond this year. So that program could potentially go away. It does not include some funding that's needed for the University of Maine system to ensure that they can continue to deliver certain programs. It also does not include some additional funding that's needed for healthcare and for cost of living adjustments for workers. So if we're going to address those, what do we need to do? We need to raise revenue. And the way we can raise revenue is by taxing wealthy people. So just yesterday, we had a hearing of a tax on people on income above $1 million, a 4% tax on income above $1 million. Seems to make sense, right? It was very interesting to sit in that hearing room and hear one of the lawmakers, a Republican from Lewiston, Auburn area, basically say, so you're punishing success. And what I wanted to say is we're promoting success. Because again, if we reflect on my dad's experience, somebody somewhere stood up and paid their fair share, which created an opportunity that now has yielded tremendous dividends, right? So the governor actually has put forward in her original budget proposal some ways to raise taxes. And that included things like a tax on pharmaceuticals, a tax on what's called an ambulance tax, cigarettes. Now, when I say those things, does an ambulance tax sound like something that you would want? No. So even if technically it's a sound policy, because the pharmaceutical tax actually interestingly is, because it ultimately holds people harmless and it leverages significant federal funds. But the problem is, are we dealing with rational actors and honest portrayals of public policy once it gets out into the public space? No. I guarantee you, if those taxes get passed, there will be a ballot referendum sponsored by Republicans to try and roll that back, but more importantly, to beat the heck out of Democrats and have working people once again feel like they're not being protected or looked out for by Democrats. So the other reason why we should center tax fairness in our conversation around tax policy is it turns out that it's an equal opportunity offender when you say the economy is rigged and so is the tax code. Republicans support raising taxes on the wealthy and large corporations. Democrats support raising taxes on the wealthy and large corporations, and so do independents. And guess what? So do even some wealthy people. At this hearing yesterday, there were 80 people who testified. 8 of them were people who identified as high net worth individuals who were going to have to pay this tax if it passed. And they got it. One of them was a guy named John Coleman, who runs an ad agency down in Portland. He grew up in Kennebec County, went to school at Coney. He had a learning disability. He got services as a kid. He went on to the University of Maine, got his engineering degree. And as he said in his testimony, like all engineers, he went into communications. But he's run a very successful communications business firm. And he is somebody who would be impacted by the proposal to raise taxes on millionaires and the proposal to tax unearned income capital gains above $500,000 for a couple. Wouldn't you like to be able to get capital gains of $500,000? As one of the other wealthy individuals said to the taxation committee, she said, look, you know, I pay people to help me do my taxes and save me money where it's legal to do so. you guys are actually going to save me a lot more money than those people do by not taxing me. This was to the Republican members around the horn. And she said, you know, my calculation is I would owe $40,000 more in taxes on $1.7 million in unearned income. So it's not from work, it's just inherited wealth that's been accumulating. She said that's a rounding error. So I think it's really interesting. So that's going to be a fight that's going to come to us not only during this legislative session, but during next year's election cycle. All right, one more slide, please. Actually, two more. So action items for you all. Help your neighbor connect the dots, right? So this conversation about Medicaid and Maine Care, for instance. When we lived in Bremen, we lived across the street from a great family. And we had very different political views. We swapped signs with them during the Obama election. That was a lot of fun. But they sent their kids to the Coastal Christian. And every now and again, he'd come over and try to get our goat by saying, I'm sick and tired of paying for your kids to go to public school. And the day I'd finally had enough and said, I'm sick and tired of your kids getting health care and paying for it, was the day we were like, okay, we're on equal footing here, right? But I don't think he had connected the dots, that the health care they were on was not their God-given right. I mean, it should be, arguably, right? But it was made possible by investments in public structures. My favorite meme is the one that is, there goes that socialist snowplow, right? So I think we really have to do the job of helping connect the dots for folks. You do that in a number of ways. You do that by understanding how some of these things are rippling through. You know, there's a great news story a couple of weeks back when this was from out west, a mom was sort of bemoaning the fact that her son and daughter-in-law had lost their jobs with the National Forest Service. She said, I voted for Trump. I didn't think this was going to happen. Right? And I think there's going to be a lot of that. I think there's a lot of that. So helping people connect the dots, and that's one thing we will be engaged in. You know, there is data now that shows how much each school in this state, each school district, is getting from federal education dollars and what could happen if those dollars are lost. Well, guess what that means for someone locally? If you take, and I don't know what the number is, so don't quote me, but let's just say for the sake of argument, you take $200,000 out of GSB for special ed services, other supports, where's that money come from? Oh, guess what, friend? It comes, either you're going to do without those things, so maybe your kid who's benefiting from those services no longer gets them, or it's going to come on your property tax bill, right? So there is a direct connection between cuts at the federal level to what people are going to experience at the local level. Push for tax fairness. I'm telling you, it is a winning issue. The hands-off event that I think you were referencing on April 5th, right? A lot of what that's about and a lot of what the Trump administration is about, make no mistake, Elon Musk and Doge, he's not about government efficiency. Not one single bit. He's about cutting, creating chaos, getting people to take their eyes off the ball so that eventually they have the resources in hand to give trillions of dollars worth of tax cuts to billionaires and their corporate cronies. That is what that game is about. So we get to push back the other way. Run for local office, and specifically, I hate to say this, and I served on the Bremen School Committee way back when. I won by 4 votes. It's the only election I've ever run for. But some of my colleagues at MESEP said, please, please, please tell people they should run for their local school boards. And I will tell you why. Part of why we got to where we are, and I think all of us can recognize this, is there were intentional efforts over a number of years to build out a conservative infrastructure that we are now running behind on. And one way in which that is currently taking hold in this state is there are intentional efforts to stack school boards around the state driven by cultural issues and getting people to run who are ultimately going to do things that are not in the best interest of our communities or of our kids. And the only way we combat that is to either show up ourselves and run or show up ourselves and run. Because the reality is, if you show up at the school board meeting, it's probably too late. If you get riled up because you heard that the school board's doing something crazy, it's probably too late in a lot of instances because they're already one step ahead in that scenario. Stay engaged. You guys are doing that. I think the action group, I know Indivisible that Steve's involved with, those things are good. And then just being aware of efforts to undercut democracy and important policy advances. I mean, you all are there. Okay, I want to leave you with one last thought and one last slide. So Autumn, if I can trouble you one more time. So in all the work I've done at the Maine Center for Economic Policy and looking at issues in the state, this is research that stays with me the most. So this is research that was done several years ago, actually. And what it does is it looks at what happens when you boost the income. This is from the late 70s, early 80s, actually. So if you advance this for inflation, obviously these numbers would be bigger. But at the time, families earning less than $25,000 were deemed as sort of low income, under-resourced households. And if you boosted that household's income by $3,000 a year, when the child was under the age of 5, the lifetime earning potential of that child went up by 17%. If you did it when that child in that same socioeconomic situation was between 6 and 10, it only went up by 4%. So what's going on there? Well, there are two things. 0 to 5 is when the bulk of the brain development is happening, right? And what we know from research is that traumatic experiences and adverse childhood experiences can significantly alter a child's life trajectory in terms of their readiness to learn and in terms of their long-term outcomes. But if you can get the resources in hand to that family that they need, they will accrue to the benefit of the child and put them in a better position long-term. So that's what that's about. Because look what happens for the same intervention with a family that's reasonably well-resourced at the time in those numbers. It's just a 2% bump, right? And similarly, it's negligible at the older age. So a lot of the work, when I talk about the fact that we, for instance, through the tax code, have gotten $960 on average to the bottom 20% of households, part of what's driving that is this fundamental belief that if we can reach those families at an early age, when children are young, we can make a difference. If I had one initiative that I've noodled around in my head with, it's we can find every kid in Lincoln County who's under the age of 5. Imagine a guaranteed basic income program for those households and those families. So a couple of years ago, I was working with the United Way of Greater Portland, and they were starting a $3 million initiative to deal with child development and economic issues for families. And I showed them this data, and I said, look, I understand and appreciate that you guys want to do a bunch of programs and that you want to take this $3 million and you're going to start this initiative here and this initiative here, and you're going to get frustrated because the people that you want to reach aren't showing up. I said, look, just cut checks. Just cut checks. And I understand, too, that you're concerned that maybe they're not going to spend the money in the way that you think they should. But the reality is you're taking stress off of a family that's benefiting the child ultimately and is going to improve outcomes long term. All right. So that's my stump speech on that. I think we are at the end of my formal presentation. As Keith said, we do spend a lot of time in Augusta working on a range of issues, but primarily our focus is on tax and budget stuff, and then also issues affecting workers and labor rights, so those kinds of things. If you follow our blog, we are constantly updating with information about what the impacts are in Maine and on Maine people. The other thing I brought with me tonight, and now that I'm looking at it, it didn't print out so well, but I'll share this with Keith and folks to get around. But one of the things we've also done through the years is we create fact sheets for each legislative district. And so we provide information on the total population, the unemployment rates, a whole host of economic factors, but also things like number of tax filers who are taking the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, number of people who live in poverty in each district, number of people who are on Medicare and use SNAP. And so this covers all the House districts in Lincoln County, so 45, 46, 47, 48, 53, and 62. And I would also commend this to you. We actually meet with all the lawmakers and provide this to them just as a resource so that they're aware if they're going to vote to cut certain programs, that has real implications for people in their districts. And so that's one way to help connect the dots.
Online wants you to really comment about taxing wealth. And I think it means like big wealth, not just income, but wealth.
Yeah. We need to tax wealth. The problem is it's a little tricky to figure out how to do it effectively. But at least in Maine, the proposal that we were involved with yesterday was actually taxing unearned income, which basically comes from having wealth, right? If you got a lot of money sitting in the stock market, you're just going to get rich by having money sitting in the stock market. Well, you might not be right now, but that's historically been one way to do it. There are other ways. I mean, property taxes are interesting because theoretically, that's where a lot of wealth is for people, right? But there's actually a proposal in the legislature from Speaker Fecteau that is going to increase the real estate transfer tax on home sales above $1 million and use that money to support affordable housing development, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, taxing wealth is, income inequality is one thing from the floor to here. Wealth inequality is from the floor through the ceiling. Now, if I had my druthers from a tax policy perspective, the first thing you need to do is tax the heck out of income above a certain threshold because that helps to shunt the accumulation of wealth to begin with. So, name your number. Is it $1 million? Is it $2 million? But the fact that we were at a 70% top marginal rate at the federal level before Reagan took office and they cut it down to 28% tells you everything you need to know. Because when you look at wealth accumulation and this ballooning discrepancy between what workers are earning and what CEOs are earning, that's also has to do with how money is being taxed and how people are allowed to accumulate and keep that money and pass it on. So,
one question for me, thinking about your last slide on the impact on younger kids.
right.
Just can you give everybody an update on sort of what's been happening on sort of the child care issues in the state, because that's another way that we can provide a lot of support for younger kids.
Yeah. So this is a really good example again of where federal state partnership makes a big difference. But child care, direct care, both of them have similar issues, right? Which is they cost a lot of money, but the people who are doing those jobs aren't getting paid a lot of money. And as a consequence, in those sectors, we are seeing shortages in the workforce. And therefore, it becomes even harder for the people who need those services to get those services. And so with childcare, there are a couple of things that have been done recently. And interestingly, again, the governor in her original budget proposal was rolling them back because she basically was saying we don't have the money to do it, even though we do. And so with regard to childcare, there were two important things. One was increasing the reimbursements so that they could basically pay their workers more. And then the other was providing childcare workers with additional stipends to support learning opportunities. And for the childcare providers that we work with, they, to a T, said this has helped them tremendously in terms of reducing turnover among their workers, because whether they're in childcare or you're in direct care, and there are a number of direct care workers that we've worked with who have made the comment that said along the lines of, look, at some point, you can only handle so much physical stress, so much mental and emotional stress, and not realize that you're getting paid subpar wages and you could go work at Walmart earning more than you're working in a care facility and leave your job at the door when you go home and feel physically like you haven't been completely run through the ringer. So those two areas are, I hate to say it this way, but those are publicly subsidized low wage work, because the bulk of money to fund those endeavors comes through public reimbursements. The last thing I'll say about childcare is that childcare is also interesting in that if it were more readily available for families and affordable, we would have somewhere order of magnitude of 24,000 more people in the workforce. But we have people who are stepping out of the workforce because of childcare limitations and because of how much it costs. So it's one we're working on. I know you are too.
And if people want to support the work of MESEP, how can they do that?
We are a nonprofit organization, so thank you, Keith. We do rely on contributions like so many other nonprofits in the state. I think that the case I would make about our work and why we're a good investment in this regard is the money that people contribute to MESEP is money that gets leveraged in pretty significant ways. So when you look at the fact, for instance, that so many people now are getting increases in their wages because of the minimum wage changes, or are getting a boost in their income by filing their taxes, all those changes came about because of work that we did. But the other thing about this work is Maine, and I want to reinforce this for you all too, we're very lucky in Maine in that there are so few degrees of separation, which means that you can really engage with your policymakers and make a difference. And Cameron Rennie, I am proud to say, was somebody on our tax scorecard who came out as a tax champion. She voted all the right ways on tax fairness measures last year. But so because though the legislature is a citizen legislature that is part-time, poorly compensated, and is term limited, and because the staff that is in the legislature is largely, it's limited staffing for lawmakers. They don't have very much policy support at all. And so groups like ours are vitally important to making sure that policymakers have the information they need to make good decisions. But also because Maine is such a shallow bench in terms of economic analysis, the media also needs that. So we have been really instrumental in those efforts. And you can certainly contribute if you go to our website at www.mesep.org. There is a donate link there. The other thing I will say, and I can acknowledge in this room, we also have a C4, which means that we can engage in political work. Now, we don't endorse candidates, but what we do is we work with candidates to understand the issues and help them think about how they might message on stuff and how they're dealing with that. And so, for instance, one of my top goals, and I would love to enlist everybody's support in this room for this coming 2026 election cycle. One of our top goals is to get a Democratic candidate who can actually utter the words that we should tax the wealthy and be okay with that. And more than be okay with that, understand that that is actually a winning message. When you go back and look at who some Bernie supporters were, a lot of those people wound up voting for Trump because Trump was striking the same chord with them. And that chord was, this economy is rigged. We've been losing ground. And the only way we're going to reclaim our share is when everybody pays their fair share. And we're paying more than our fair share, and there are people that aren't. 50 of the largest corporations in this country paid no income tax in a 4-year period from 2020 to 2024. At least 1 year, 50 of those largest corporations. Think about that. So people know the system's rigged, but we need to help them appreciate that government has a role to play in unrigging it. So I could go on a whole diatribe about the.
Thanks, Garrett. Let's give Garrett a hand. That was terrific. That was chock full of a lot of really great information and a really great resource for all of us.